Hybrid Heaven. Now this is a game I've been trying to get for a while, and after playing it, I think I can sum it up with one word. Strange. This is very much a different kind of game than really any I was expecting. Now the story as presented in the opening cutscene is, you are this guy, except you're not because he was shot by this guy, who is you, except he's a different person than you are because you are the guy he just shot, except now he's dead. Because the guy you are isn't who you are, and instead you end up working for the aliens, except you don't, and you end up falling into their secret base. You with me so far? Because if not, don't worry, because that's about as accurate as the plot actually tells you from the start. It's not until about 3 chapters in that you actually get a story about how there's an invasion of the body snatchers type scenario where there are aliens creating a human-alien hybrid race to take over the entire Erath by replacing the President of the United States of America, and somehow they're going to take over the entire world, which, logistics of that not ever possibly working aside, the story starts out so incredibly convoluted, and it only seems to exist for convolution's sake, instead of, an actual reason. You're gonna see that as a constant theme with this game, but we'll get to that in a sec. Beyond the overall confusing bit of how the story starts out, however, the entire story is basically invasion of the body snatchers style type thing, where you're the president's head of security and you're the only person who can stop it for reasons. Yeah, that's a pretty good summary, actually. However, the way they deliver it is kind of inept and feels like they've never told a story before, like, ever. Also, 64-bit nudity! Just making sure you were paying attention. Anyway, moving on. Now, gameplay-wise is where Hybrid Heaven gets really, really interesting and really, really weird very quickly. Now, the main event is essentially a type of adventure game where you run around this giant steel maze of twisting corridors. You have a gun equipped to you, although it only affects robotic things, so you can't even really use it as a gun, which is strange because enemies have guns they can use on you. And you can also get guns later you can use on enemies, but those are one-shot items. I have no idea why your main gun can't be used, like a gun, but yeah, you've got an electric gun that I guess is powered by magnets, so it shuts off security devices. Now, speaking of the gun, using it's very awkward because aiming not only requires the N64 control stick, which, let's just be honest, wasn't exactly made for this, it's heavily reliant on auto-aim. Essentially, you can pick 3 different heights to aim at, directly on top of you, directly below you, and sort of directly in front of you, and then hope that whatever you're shooting at gets shot at. It's not exactly the greatest system, but it kind of sort of works. And as clunky as this is basically where the core problem-solving mechanics of running around this world comes from. Basically, there are 2 types of puzzles, one which require you to shoot things with your electric gun, and the other which is run to a console to update your keycard to unlock another door. And honestly, these puzzles aren't terribly interesting, and the hidden bits aren't very well hidden either. So the fact that they're here is a little bit confusing. But what's even more confusing is, while this might initially look like a very, very bland adventure game, it's actually an RPG. Yeah. See, once you come into a certain number of rooms, you'll run into biologic aberrations, which you actually unlock during the intro, through your own confusion and ineptitude, which, going back to how the intro was so confusing, might have actually been kind of brilliant. Huh. Once you get into a fight with these monsters, suddenly it's no more about shooting with your crappy gun that can't be used as a gun. Instead, it's sort of like an active time-based, turn-based RPG, sort of like the old Super Nintendo Final Fantasies. If you look in the top left corner, you can see a power meter. Once that meter fills out about a quarter of the way, you can attack your opponent. If you manage to fill it up all the way, your attacks will do a lot more damage. And as you get stronger, you can stack power bars by holding onto them longer instead of expending them, to perform both combo attacks, as well as just using several attacks in a row. And while you're waiting for your bar, your opponent also has a power bar that's loading up that will have them attack. Should they attack, you have 3 options. You have the ability to guard, you have the ability to counter, and you have a type of evasion type escape ability. Essentially, you pick which ability is useful for the situation. Likewise, in combat, you have 3 offensive abilities. You have punches, you have kicks, and you have grapple moves. And while both of these feel like they give you a great amount of variance to your combat, it's kind of not true. And here's why. Let's start with defense. Defensively, you can guard, you can escape, or you can counter. Now the thing is, with these abilities, they all have varying success rates. Guard seems to reduce the amount of damage you take to about 1/5 what you normally would should it succeed, and it has something like a 50% chance of working. Escapes prevent you from being attacked entirely, but that's assuming you get out of the opponent's attack range, which is very rare when it happens. And countering allows you to not only avoid the attack, but get some damage in as well. However, countering, much like escaping, is very, very rare to actually succeed. In fact, countering, I think, only had something like a 5% success rate when I actually tried, every time. So while you've got 3 separate options, there's really only one that's actually valuable: guarding. Because that one you have about a 50-50% chance of actually succeeding with and taking reduced damage, whereas the others have such a astronomically low value of success that you're basically just going to be given full damage. And there's a special reason why you want to guard, but we'll cover that after we talk about offense. Now, offense, you have 3 different abilities: your punch, your kick, and your grapple abilities. And each one of these has dozens of different moves that you can learn from your opponents, but 2/3 of these attack options are basically completely invalid. And the reason why is punching and kicking can both inherently miss your opponent, thus draining an entire bar and accomplishing nothing and making you more prone to getting hit, whereas grappling actually does not. Press the R button in combat, you suddenly lock arms with your opponent, and if you're given initiative, which if you've got a full bar and you initiated grappling, then you always do, then you can use your ability, and you're pretty much guaranteed the hit. So while you have 3 offensive abilities, the other 2 really just serve to give you variance that doesn't ever really work, whereas with grappling, you're pretty much guaranteed with it. In fact, the only time grappling never worked with me was one specific enemy who could auto-reverse every type of grapple. Honestly, with that one exception, you could basically go through the entire game with your basic grapple attack. Now back to the main focus of combat, instead of the intricacies of attack and defense, is learning new abilities. Now like I said, you could basically make your way through with the basic things you start with, namely your basic grapple attack, but you can learn new abilities by getting attacked by your opponent. The more times you get attacked, the greater a chance you learn it from your opponent. And by guarding, you have a greater chance of learning it because you survive the attack. Hence going back to why guarding is so important. As well, every time you get attacked, you have a chance of leveling up your various body parts. For example, if your left arm keeps getting attacked, your left arm will eventually start taking less damage, because each independent appendage you have has its own defensive rate. As well, the more you use it, it gains more offense. And that's a really cool concept. I really like that, and that helps to reinforce the fact that this game is, at its heart, an RPG. A very convoluted one, perhaps, but an RPG nonetheless. So learning new abilities and combating your opponents is a fairly in-depth system, at least conceptually, but like I said, there's really not a lot of reason to actually go and explore it, because the most basic grapple works on 99% of your opponents, and tends to be the most effective option because it has the least amount of chance of failing, just like guarding is the most effective way of defense. If the developers had created these tools to use in combat and made them a little bit more effective to give you a wider variety of strategy to employ, the combat in this game would be infinitely better. But as it stands, it's just sort of a weird RPG system that decided to use the combat from one of those N64 wrestling games. Which, don't get me wrong, is a really cool idea, but it's not really taken anywhere past conceptual level. And that's honestly the biggest problem this game has, is it feels like the people who made this game just sat around at a table and said, you know what's cool? X is cool, let's add X. But they never really thought of what that sort of means to add it to the game. They never really sort of sought out the various connections of these different mechanics to try and make it a meaningful thing. I mean, case in point, I'm pretty sure someone at the development meeting just sat there and said, you know what's cool? Survival horror. So, case in point, all of Chapter 2 is a survival horror style game where you basically have to run from a giant monster that can wreck you and you can't ever attack it. But there's no real adequate point to it. It's just there for the sake of being there. And I mean, that's the biggest problem this game has. So many cool ideas all come together, sure, but it just doesn't work. Now, the overall presentation to Hybrid Heaven is, well, like the rest of the game, pretty interesting. The environments look pretty bland and forgettable, and trust me, you're going to be running around these steel corridors for hours, but the character models themselves actually look pretty interesting. Now, the real meat and potatoes of why the visual presentation of this game is so cool is just the animation. Shows that there is definitely a lot of work being put into this game. It might have been misguided, but I have to appreciate all the different animation and how well all the different characters interact with each other while they're fighting. Audibly, like visually, this game is kind of a mixed bag. The sound effects and music are nothing special. The music itself does what it needs to do for a sort of action suspense style game, however none of it is remotely memorable or honestly noteworthy. The voice acting, or at least what little of it there is actually really well done. Like in the opening cutscene, all the voice acting is really well done, but what's probably most impressive is just how crystal clear the audio itself is. Because, you know, this is on a cartridge, and it's pretty notorious how compressed audio gets on cartridge just to fit it. So the fact that it came through as clear in the opening as it did is very impressive, to say the least. Now, if you want a copy of Hybrid Heaven, it's not going to cost you very much, mainly because it's not in high demand. This game is actually pretty uncommon. Case in point, before this copy ever came to my doorstep, I'd never even seen a copy before. But if you want a copy on eBay, you can find it pretty handily for $5 to $15. It shouldn't cost you very much, and right about now I should give a special thank you and shout out to YouTube user NicoDemR for sending a copy to the show, along with 2 other games that I'm going to cover very soon. And I'll be sure to drop a link in the description to his channel, so send him a big thanks from me. Overall, I think Hybrid Heaven is a very interesting style game. I think at its core, it would be interesting to people studying game theory, and if you really like strange, eclectic games that no one really ever talks about. And I think it is probably one of the best examples I could ever point out to meaningful choices in game design, because this game doesn't seem to have, like, any. And that's kind of a problem, because in a well-designed game, everything from the tile sets, the music, the character designs, and overall progression, literally everything in a game, has to be well thought out and planned to create an enjoyable, meaningful experience. But in this game, once again, it feels like everyone just sort of sat around at the meeting saying, you know what's cool? X is cool, let's add X. But no one really thought, well, what does X add to this game? What does X mean to the rest of this game? What does X do to contribute to the overall flow of the game? And because this game feels like it's lacking any real meaningful choice behind what it's doing, it just feels kind of like a mess. But I think if I had to make an analogy for Hybrid Heaven, it would be like this old quilt my mom used to have. It was made of like 80 different t-shirts, and none of the patterns and none of the colors matched, and it looked like it was falling apart at the seams. But something about it was just charming. And I think that's the perfect way to describe Hybrid Heaven, because while it is kind of a mess, a lot of the things in this game do contribute to an interesting idea. Something that, if someone were to recreate a game like this, might actually make something really interesting. Like an RPG with a fighting game system with all different kinds of fighting styles. That's a cool idea. A sort of dark, mysterious, aliens invade, you don't know who to trust style game. That's cool. A survival horror where you're being chased by a giant monster. Well, I mean, that's every survival horror, but, you know, it works. At its core, Hybrid Heaven is a large number of ideas that just don't work when they're mashed together. But the game itself is still pretty fun, if only to see how these different concepts interact with each other, and if only to learn how to do it better in the future. Ultimately, while I can't recommend Hybrid Heaven as a great game, it's certainly an interesting one, and if you're interested in studying games, absolutely pick it up. And if you like RPGs, well, this is easily one of the 4 best on the N64, and that's because I'm being generous today and actually acknowledging Quest 64's existence. But you know, Hybrid Heaven isn't an awful game.